Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, November 10th, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at President Joe Biden's approval rating in relation to the Democratic Party's performance across the nation and in recent elections. Now, I know you might be feeling that we have talked about this for quite some time, and that is entirely true. We have been talking about the president's approval rating, but I actually want to compare this to the 2010 and 2014 midterm elections to show you that this election year might be a little bit different. The reason why I'm saying that is because President Biden's approval rating has been pretty negative right now, and thus the Democratic Party is ultimately falling off in terms of public support across the nation. But that was not the case back in 2010 and 2014, or at least 2009 and 2013, leading into those very bad election years for the Democratic Party. Ultimately, the approval rating of the president did not necessarily translate into Democrats dipping in support super significantly. And I'll show you what I mean by that as we go through these numbers. So today, as it stands, Joe Biden has a disapproval rating of about 8.3% net nationwide, which means 8.3% more of the nation disapproves of him than they do approve. And you can probably expect that number to be slightly higher simply because these numbers do tend to skew towards the left. Ultimately speaking, Joe Biden has a 43% approval rating and a 51.3% disapproval rating. This is very different from where it was a year ago today, in which Joe Biden was approved of by about 8-9 points nationwide, and it is the exact opposite at this time, which means there have been significant losses in terms of support for the president, and you can see this across a number of areas. If you take a look at President Biden's favorability rating from before the election, you might actually see that at this point in time during the campaign season, or not the campaign season, technically speaking for Georgia, but ultimately the election season, you can see that despite a few outliers from Monmouth and the Economist polls here, you can see that the approval rating here +6, +16, +14, some of them +1, right? These are more of the outliers as well, +6, +20, +18, then another outlier, a tie, then +9, +14. So you can sort of understand that at this point in time, the approval rating of Joe Biden was pretty positive, and it was overall a very good result. Now, on election day, I also want to point this out as a means of comparing the shifts in many of these states. You had about a +5-6 point margin across the nation, right? Which means that when you take a look at the approval rating now, you see that it's -8. So that's a 13-point shift. I want to point out that the shift in the state of Virginia and New Jersey have shifted by roughly that amount. Now, I did believe previously that the shift was about 15 points. Upon revision on the Real Clear Politics averages there, I see that the number there was actually not +7 for Joe Biden on election day, but probably around +5-6 points. But the point being that the shift in approval rating has pretty much dictated the Democratic Party's performance. But for President Obama, this is actually not the same story that has been told. Yes, you know how 2010 and 2014 were horrible years for the Democratic Party, and you think that primarily it had to do with President Obama's approval rating, and I think that is a completely valid reason. But it doesn't always end up being true, and 2009 and 2013 are perfect examples of such a situation. For instance, when you take a look at President Obama's approval rating, it started dipping around the months of June, July, and August. From then, it started to get down to an extremely negative point. But at a point in time, right here, December 3rd, 2013, my birthday, right? President Obama had a disapproval rating higher than his approval rating with a net negative 16 points nationwide. Now, that is actually one of the lowest points we have seen President Obama at in terms of overall net approval rating. In fact, that may have been his lowest point of his entire presidency. With those numbers, you would expect Democrats to be at a fallout by -10, -11 points, maybe even -16, right? Well, when you take a look at December 3rd, 2013, this is what the numbers told us. On December 3rd, 2013, the Republican average victory was +2.5% across the nation. 2.5% when Obama was down 16 points nationwide. It actually gets worse from there when you're talking about how the Republican Party was failing to utilize the disapproval rating of the president effectively, at least for 2013. If you wonder why Terry McAuliffe was able to win in 2013, the national environment actually was just as negative against President Obama as it was for President Biden. The only difference there was that Terry McAuliffe took a very different type of campaign strategy. And also, there might not necessarily have been that much party fatigue. But to ignore the reality of what happened in 2021 as a repudiation against President Biden is also to ignore a very real reality here. But the point being that the public response, for instance, let's take a look here. -7 points, September 3rd, 2013. These are the numbers on September 3rd, 2013. The numbers here showed the Democrats with a 2-point victory nationwide. In fact, what seems to be the highest lead of either political party during the entire 2013-2014 campaign season was right around here, when Democrats maintained a 7-point lead on the national generic congressional vote on October 29th, 2013. Well, President Obama's approval rating on October 29th, 2013 was negative. In fact, it was down by a margin of 8 points nationwide. Isn't that something? It also goes back to 2010. Again, this election year is not like the ones we've seen in the past. Typically speaking, Democrats should last throughout the year with an advantage over Republicans, as they did in 2009, 2013, 2017. That is when the tipping point typically happens, when Republicans begin to take a lead over Democrats. It doesn't happen this early on, and yet it has already started to happen. Democrats can try to push this out for a month or two, and then you reach that turning point, and maybe it will replicate what we've seen in the past. But as the polls have been showing us, recently speaking, with President Biden's dip in overall approval rating, the numbers on the 2022 generic ballot have been dipping as well. CNN has the Democrats up by 5, but Emerson has the Republicans up by 7. Harvard-Harris has the Republicans up by 3, but NBC News has the Democrats up by 2. What does this average out to? What do all of these polls tell us? The Democrats maintain a lead of 0.4%. All it takes is another Republican poll to flip it for the Republican. And that ultimately means Republicans have complete and total authority over 2022. Because keep in mind that the entire nation skews towards the left. There are more registered Democrats than there are registered Republicans. Democrats will more than likely win the popular vote in a standard presidential election year in the next 10, 20 years because of population growth and these population centers. But when it comes down to an election like this one, we aren't expecting Democrats to maintain that sort of lead. It'd be nice for them to do so for their own sake, but when it comes down to what we've seen on the national environment, seeing Republicans start to take a lead makes sense. But it's just very interesting to see that in years past, under Obama, in what ended up being abysmal years for the Democratic Party, they still hadn't seen these many cracks this early on, which means something is very different about 2022. It could either be very different pertaining to benefiting the Democratic Party, or it could mean we are in for a bigger red wave that we can even think about. But I think that right now it's too early to sort of indicate that either of the two are the very likely outcomes of 2022. But I just want to show you for comparison because it is super important to understand. So just looking at the Biden approval rating here, even compared to President Trump, you see where this is lacking. President Donald Trump ended off with a very low approval rating by the time he left office. But right about this time period, he was actually in his lowest point. That could be the same thing for President Biden. He could be reaching his lowest point of his presidency right now. If he is a one-term president, it might replicate what we've seen with President Trump. But that isn't necessarily the likeliest outcome. President Biden hasn't been pleasing many of the people on the left wing and obviously not on the right wing. And with that combined support and with independents turning away from the person that they voted for a year ago, that's where you start to see these numbers fall. But President Trump actually was just about 5 points away from where Joe Biden is today. If you take a look at the flashback 4 years ago, Donald Trump is 5.1% away from where Biden is today in terms of overall approval, to put things into context. Joe Biden should not just be 5 points above Donald Trump. In the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden was up about 14 points higher than where Donald Trump was in terms of net favorability rating. And yet somehow today, that is reduced to 5. That's about a 9-point reduction, not necessarily the worst for Democrats compared to the 13-point reduction they've seen in Virginia, New Jersey on the national level, but it's still a major reduction. You can't ignore -9, and you certainly cannot ignore -13. So as we move into the future elections, I think that we are going to see the public directly respond to Biden's approval rating in a way that they might not have for President Obama. And the only thing that I can really think about that is contrary to my point is the 2021 California gubernatorial recall election, in which the Democratic Party actually turned out in a way that they hadn't in the past. In 2018, Gavin Newsom received 7.7 million votes for him, with 61.9% of the vote. In 2021, Gavin Newsom was kept by a margin with 61.9% of the vote with 7.9 million votes, which means that Gavin Newsom was kept in office by more votes than he was in 2018. Elected in 2018, might I add. The margin, the exact same, but the amount of votes here increased for Democrats, ultimately showing at this point in time, September 14th, Biden was down about 4 points nationwide, showing us that at that point in time, the approval rating was not bogging down solid Democratic states. But by the time we reached the November timeframe, we realized it was beginning to bog down other Democratic states. New Jersey, for instance, a state that Joe Biden won by 16 points, well, here's the margin for 2021. What is that margin? 3 points. Shifted 13 points. Remember that number. 2021, another state. Joe Biden won by 10 points, and Glenn Youngkin wins by 2.9. It's by 3 if you round up, a 13-point shift. I'm not trying to say that these shifts are perfectly accurate, just coincidentally speaking, they seem to be pretty spot on when it comes down to this race compared to President Biden's approval rating. But I think it is very interesting to take a look at that you are already starting to see the anti-Biden wave, the anti-Biden sentiment pour out and show up in full force in these races that benefit the GOP in ways that they simply did not in 2013 and 2009. And even in the generic ballot, cracks are beginning to break. You are starting to see a rift here between the Republicans and the Democrats. What used to be long-lasting Democratic support in the 2022 generic congressional ballot, obviously exceptions. You can't deny there are some exceptions. The Federalist, a Republican news source, obviously going to show the Republicans ahead. Quinnipiac, for some reason, back in October, made a little bit of sense because of Biden's approval rating, but wasn't matching the average. Now you're starting to see more than just the Federalist. Now you're starting to see more than just Quinnipiac. You are starting to see more and more reputable pollsters show the Republican Party ahead. In fact, Emerson College, which was within 3 points of every single competitive race in the 2021 election cycle, within 3 percentage points, says the Republicans are ahead by 7. And USA Today and Suffolk University put the Republicans ahead by 8. Economist YouGov released a poll today that shows the Democrats ahead by 7. They also did that back in Halloween timeframe, early November election, 10:30 to 11:02. But ultimately, we know that that one is more than likely the outlier here, and the average remains somewhere around even between the Democrats and the Republicans, as the RCP average might denote. In addition to that, I think that one could argue that with the Democrats with such a narrow advantage, that silent Republican vote is still present. And it might not be much, but it's certainly enough to overturn 0.4%. And if I was asked about that question, which I am right now, I would also agree with such a statement. I think it is entirely possible that Republicans have that advantage nationwide because they've built up the momentum. They have the energy. This is on their side. 2022, I think for the Senate, is the Democratic Party's case to lose. For the House, I think it's the opposite. But right now, the House seems to be going very well for the GOP, and the Senate seems to be a little bit tricky, with Chris Sununu not announcing his bid for Senate, instead deciding to run for governor again in the state of New Hampshire. In addition to that, there are a couple of other hurdles for the GOP that were not necessarily hurdles for 2021. For instance, a very high Trump surge in terms of the GOP nominees. They didn't have that case in Virginia. But then again, in Jack Ciattarelli's race in the state of New Jersey, he was one of the most extreme Republican nominees we have seen in quite some time. And yet he came very close to winning the governor's mansion in the state of New Jersey. So it might not necessarily be that bad for Republicans to run Trump-style candidates. We will see what happens, though. I think that it all comes down to an individual basis, and it all really depends on President Biden's approval rating. But I just wanted to make this video to show you a bit of context about historical standing. Does Biden match the expectations and the performances of Democrats in 2009 and 2013? Does he match with the generic ballot? Do Democrats today match where they were 8 years ago, 12 years ago? And the answer is a resounding no. There seemed to have been more support for Democrats that were withstanding to the approval rating of the president then than they were now. It could be because Obama won both of his elections by a larger margin than Biden did. It could be because the Democrats had sometimes a 60-seat majority in the United States Senate in 2008. They also had 250 House seats. Today, they have 50 and 222. It could be that. But also in 2013, Democrats were about to lose the Senate a year later, which they did, and ultimately the House was already out of their control, with Republicans holding about 230 seats in the House of Representatives. So it might not necessarily be the fact that there's a trifecta. It could be the fact that there's a trifecta. I don't think that's something that we have much time to explore in this video, but I do think that overall here, it is not fair to compare the two elections, 2013 and 2022, 2014 and 2022, or even 2010 and 2022 as it stands today. It might have been comparable in the past, or the past couple of months, but as we are starting to see, big differences here. And matching approval ratings and dips in the polls and the favorability polls, in addition to that, to dips in the generic ballot polls. All around here, you are seeing a very negative response to Joe Biden on every single step. But that wasn't the case for Obama. It was the case for Trump. So we are starting to figure out, how are we going to end up figuring out this race? Is there huge electoral implications by knowing the fact that Biden is already weighing down the Democrats, or is this just telling us what we already knew? Is this telling us what you could already tell from 538 and Real Clear Politics? We will wait and see. I think that no matter what, the generic congressional vote will be within contention for the next couple of weeks. The Republican Party might ultimately take the lead, and at that point in time, I think Democrats need to realize that this is about playing defense rather than playing offense at this point. Many of these races they are going to heavily invest into. Florida has quickly become the most expensive Senate race of the 2022 election cycle. Well, newsflash, the Republican Party is undoubtedly going to win that Senate race, unless Marco Rubio has a major scandal or a major turnaround happens for Val Demings in that state. In 90% of scenarios, the Democrats lose. And that's just how it's been in the state of Florida. But to invest tens of millions, maybe even $100 million, as we saw with Amy McGrath and other Democratic nominees against strong GOP candidates, in strong GOP states. These are things that are wastes of money for the Democratic Party, and at that point in time, maybe if this year was a blue wave year, of course, playing the offense. Run someone in Tennessee, run someone in Mississippi who could actually win. Democrats did that in 2018. For 2022, they can't use that strategy. They don't have an excess of money. If 2020 showed them anything, it's that no matter how high turnout is, you can end up losing seats. And I think that for 2022, so much is at stake for the Biden agenda and the Biden approval rating, and thus the 2024 election, that they need to start playing things right. They need to start to realize that Biden is dipping. Voters are responding to that very negatively. And this is not the same type of thing where you can just rebound in 2012 and win because you have a charismatic Democratic candidate. People here dislike Biden, and that's translating to them disliking Democrats. That was the case in 2010 and 2014, but it took many more months to reach that point, even if the approval rating sort of reflected where we are today, 8 and 12 years ago. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen is a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.